At the will reading, my aunt said, "You get nothing." Then I got everything. The fluorescent lights of the conference room hummed, a flat, sterile sound that did nothing to cut through the tension thick enough to chew. My assistant, Mark, stood at the podium, his face a mask of forced professionalism that was cracking around the edges. He was mid-sentence, detailing projected Q4 earnings, a script I'd meticulously crafted, yet his voice wavered. He'd always been too earnest, too soft. He believed in the numbers, in the projections, in the inherent good of our enterprise. I believed in the bottom line, in the kill, in the swift, brutal acquisition of market share. He cleared his throat, his gaze flicking briefly to me, a flicker of desperation in his eyes. He was about to pivot, I could see it, a subtle shift in his posture that signaled an attempt to placate me, to steer the conversation back to the safe harbor of profitability. But the tremor in his voice, the almost imperceptible hesitation, had already set a fire in my gut. It was a weakness, a betrayal of the ruthless efficiency I demanded. We were on the cusp of a major acquisition, a deal that would redefine our company, and I needed every player on the field to be a predator, not a supplicant. And while some market fluctuations are to be expected, he continued, his voice gaining a false bravado, our diversified portfolio and strategic partnerships provide a robust buffer, ensuring sustained growth and a significant return on investment for our shareholders. He paused, waiting for the applause, for the nods of affirmation. Instead, he got silence, punctuated only by the incessant hum of the lights. My silence. I let it hang, a palpable weight in the air, watching his carefully constructed facade crumble. His eyes found mine again, and this time there was no mistaking the fear. He knew what was coming. He'd seen it before, in the eyes of competitors, in the faces of employees I deemed surplus to requirements. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to offer an explanation, an apology, anything to salvage the situation. But the words caught in his throat. He was done. Done trying to impress me, done trying to fit into the mold I'd so carelessly cast. "Mark," I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. It was low even, devoid of emotion, which was precisely why it carried such weight. Heads turned, all eyes now fixed on him, then on me. The presentation, the numbers, the acquisition, all of it receded into the background. This was the real business of the day. "You're done here." His breath hitched. The color drained from his face, leaving it a stark, ashen white. The carefully curated professionalism shattered, revealing the raw, exposed nerve beneath. He didn't argue, he didn't plead. He simply nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement, and began to gather his papers, his hands shaking so violently they rattled against the glossy presentation boards. The hum of the lights seemed to amplify, a maddening drone in the sudden vacuum of his departure. He didn't look at me again. He just walked, his shoulders hunched, a solitary figure retreating from the battlefield, leaving behind a void that felt, for the first time, strangely hollow. The silence that followed his exit was deafening. The other executives shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between me and the closed conference room door. The acquisition, the Q4 projections, the very purpose of the meeting had evaporated, replaced by the stark, brutal reality of what had just transpired. I felt a surge of something akin to satisfaction, a primal assertion of dominance. This was how the world worked. This was how I worked. You were either a predator or prey, and there was no room for sentiment, no tolerance for weakness. But as the hum of the lights continued, a persistent, unnerving thrum, a subtle dissonance began to creep into my conviction. Mark's departure, so swift and decisive, had left a void, yes, but it wasn't just the absence of his presence. It was the absence of something else, something I couldn't quite articulate. It was the quiet way he'd gathered his things, the utter lack of protest, the defeated slump of his shoulders. He hadn't fought back, hadn't raged or pleaded. He had simply accepted his fate, a fate I had so casually, so cruelly dictated. And in that quiet acceptance, I saw not weakness, but a profound, unsettling dignity. The deal was finalized a week later. The acquisition was a success, a triumph that sent ripples of adulation through the company. Bonuses were distributed, accolades were showered, and I was lauded as a visionary, a titan of industry. Yet the sterile hum of the conference room, the image of Mark's ashen face, the silent, defeated retreat lingered. It was a ghost in the machine of my success, a persistent whisper of discord in the symphony of my achievements. I dismissed it as a momentary lapse, a fleeting pang of empathy that had no place in my world. But the ghost refused to be exorcised. It began to manifest in subtle ways, in the hollowness of victories, in the sterile echo of my own pronouncements. The will reading was scheduled for a Tuesday, a day I usually reserved for aggressive deal-making and hostile takeovers. My Aunt Carol's estate was not something I'd given much thought to. She was a quiet woman, a creature of habit, living a life of predictable routines in a small, unassuming house filled with trinkets and memories that held no value to me. My father, her brother, had always spoken of her with a distant affection, a polite acknowledgement of kinship rather than any deep familial bond. I'd met her perhaps a dozen times in my life, each encounter brief and forgettable, marked by her gentle inquiries about my career and my polite, dismissive answers. She represented a world I had long since outgrown, a world of quiet contentment that held no appeal for a man driven by the relentless pursuit of more. The lawyer, a Mr. Henderson, a man whose weary eyes seemed to have witnessed countless such ceremonies, cleared his throat. The room was small, stuffy, filled with the scent of old paper and potpourri. My cousins, a gaggle of distant relatives I barely recognized, sat fidgeting on worn velvet chairs. I, of course, was the sole beneficiary of my father's side of the family, a fact I'd assumed would be reflected in Aunt Carol's will as well. It was simply the natural order of things. My father had been her only sibling. Mr. Henderson began to read, his voice a low drone that did little to stir the stagnant air. He spoke of bequests to local charities, of small sums set aside for distant cousins. Then he reached the crux of the document. He paused, adjusted his spectacles, and looked directly at me. "And to my nephew," he read, his voice taking on a slightly more deliberate cadence, "you get nothing." The words landed not with a bang, but with a soft, almost apologetic thud. A ripple of surprise went through the room. My cousins exchanged bewildered glances. Nothing? It was absurd. I felt a flush of indignation, a hot wave of disbelief washing over me. Had she truly written that? Had she, in her quiet, unassuming way, dared to defy me, to deny me what was rightfully mine? It was an insult, a profound disrespect that I would not tolerate. I opened my mouth to speak, to demand an explanation, to challenge the legality of such a clause. But before I could utter a sound, Mr. Henderson continued, his voice steady. "You get nothing," he repeated, his gaze unwavering, "because you already have everything." "And—" He paused, letting the words sink in, then gestured towards a large, leather-bound ledger on the table beside him. "The entirety of my estate, including the house, its contents and all financial assets, is bequeathed to you, my dear nephew, but only on the condition that you reside in the house for a full year, and during that year you must personally tend to the garden." The ledger was heavy, its pages filled with meticulous entries detailing properties, investments, and a surprisingly substantial portfolio of art. The house, I learned, was in a desirable neighborhood, its value far exceeding my initial dismissive assessment. The garden, a sprawling, overgrown expanse, was a riot of untamed greenery, a stark contrast to the manicured perfection I usually associated with wealth. And within the house, nestled amongst the antique furniture and faded photographs, were the true treasures. A collection of rare books, a meticulously curated assortment of antique clocks, and a series of journals filled with Aunt Carol's elegant script. The first few weeks were a blur of anger and resentment. I moved into the house, a gilded cage, and stared at the unruly garden with disdain. I hired a groundskeeper intending to delegate the task, to fulfill the condition with minimal effort. But the will stipulated personal tending. The groundskeeper was dismissed. I was forced to confront the earth, the weeds, the relentless cycle of growth and decay. My hands, accustomed to the smooth feel of polished steel and crisp paper, were soon stained with soil, calloused by trowels and pruning shears. I started with the roses, their thorns a painful reminder of my initial fury. I learned their names, their needs, their delicate vulnerabilities. I discovered the quiet satisfaction of coaxing life from dormant buds, of nurturing something fragile into bloom. The journals became my nightly companions. Aunt Carol wrote not of grand ambitions or material wealth, but of small joys, the first robin of spring, the scent of rain on dry earth, the quiet companionship of her cat. She wrote of her encounters with strangers, moments of unexpected kindness, of shared laughter and silent understanding. She wrote of a life lived not in pursuit of acquisition, but in appreciation of connection. One sweltering afternoon, while I was wrestling with a particularly stubborn patch of bindweed, a young woman from next door, Maya, appeared at the fence. She was a freelance artist, her hands perpetually smudged with paint. She'd seen me struggling, her eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Instead of offering advice, she simply began to work, her movements fluid and practiced, her presence a quiet balm. We worked in companionable silence for hours, the only sounds the rustle of leaves and the gentle rasp of our tools against the earth. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, she offered me a glass of iced tea, her smile soft and genuine. It was a simple gesture, yet it felt profound, a moment of shared humanity in the quiet solitude of my imposed exile. That evening, I sat on the porch swing, the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine filling the air. The ledger lay closed on my lap. The journals were stacked neatly on the side table. The house was no longer a cage, but a sanctuary. The garden, once a symbol of my humiliation, had become a testament to my transformation. I looked at my hands, roughened and stained, and saw not the marks of a forced penance, but the evidence of a life reclaimed. The will, I realized, had not been a punishment, but a gift, a profound, unexpected, and utterly life-altering gift. The year was almost over. The garden, once a wild, neglected space, now bloomed with a vibrant, ordered beauty. The roses I'd initially resented were my pride and joy, their petals unfurling in a silent, fragrant symphony. Maya and I had become friends, our conversations flowing as easily as the water from the garden hose. She had taught me to see the world not as a series of transactions, but as a tapestry of interconnected lives. One crisp autumn morning, I stood on the porch, the morning sun warming my face. A single perfect crimson rose, its petals still beaded with dew, rested in my palm. It was the first rose I had planted, the one whose thorns had drawn my blood and my tears. It was a symbol of my own slow, arduous bloom. I looked out at the garden, a living testament to my aunt's quiet wisdom, a vibrant, breathing space that had healed me more effectively than any business deal ever could. The will had stated that the estate was mine, free and clear, once the year was complete. I could sell the house, return to my old life, and resume my relentless pursuit of acquisition. But the thought felt hollow, a distant echo of a past self. I walked back inside, the scent of old paper and blooming jasmine clinging to me like a second skin. I picked up one of Aunt Carol's journals, its pages filled with her elegant script, and a quiet understanding settled over me. I was home. The rose, still dewy and vibrant, felt impossibly light in my hand. The steady rhythm of the trowel turning the soil had become a meditation, a deliberate counterpoint to the frantic pace of my former life. It wasn't just about fulfilling a condition anymore. It was about understanding a different kind of currency, one measured not in dollars and cents, but in the vibrant hues of a blooming petunia or the sturdy resilience of an oak sapling. Now, consider how this applies when you face a situation where your established metrics for success are suddenly rendered obsolete. My aunt's garden, with its stubborn insistence on natural cycles and its quiet demand for patient observation, was forcing me to recalibrate my entire definition of value. It wasn't about acquisition, it was about cultivation. It wasn't about control, it was about collaboration with forces far older and wiser than myself. Furthermore, this newfound appreciation for organic growth extended beyond the literal earth. I began to notice the subtle shifts in my own internal landscape. The sharp edges of my ambition, once so defining, were softening, replaced by a nascent curiosity about the unseen processes that foster genuine connection. I found myself listening more intently to Maya, not to extract information for a deal, but to truly understand her perspective, the nuances of her artistic vision, the quiet passion that fueled her creations. This was a different kind of negotiation, one where the goal wasn't to win, but to connect, to find common ground in the shared human experience of creation and vulnerability. It was a revelation that the most valuable assets were not always tangible, and that true wealth could be found in shared moments of understanding. Building on this, however, the challenge wasn't simply about embracing a new philosophy. It was about actively dismantling deeply ingrained patterns of behavior. My instinct was still to analyze, to strategize, to anticipate every potential outcome. But the garden offered no clear-cut blueprints, no predictable algorithms. A late frost could decimate a season's work. A sudden downpour could wash away precious topsoil. It demanded an acceptance of impermanence, a willingness to adapt and respond to the unpredictable nature of life. This forced me to confront my own deep-seated need for absolute control. A need that had driven my professional success, but had also created a profound emotional isolation. Now, consider how this applies when your carefully constructed plans are disrupted by forces entirely beyond your influence. Consequently, my interactions with others began to reflect this internal shift. The gruff impatience that had characterized my business dealings began to recede. When Maya spoke of a creative block, I didn't offer solutions. I offered quiet solidarity, a shared understanding of the frustration that accompanies the struggle to bring something new into being. I started to recognize the unspoken needs in others, the subtle cues that indicated a desire for connection rather than conquest. It was as if a new sensory apparatus had been activated, allowing me to perceive the emotional undercurrents that had previously been invisible to me, drowned out by the clamor of my own self-interest. This was not a conscious decision, but a natural unfolding, a consequence of tending to something more profound than just the soil. Conversely, this internal recalibration also brought a deeper understanding of my aunt's motivations. Her seemingly simple life was not one of missed opportunities, but of deliberate choices. Her bequests to charity, her focus on simple pleasures, her insistence on the personal tending of the garden, these were not passive acts, but expressions of a deeply considered philosophy. She had understood, perhaps long before I did, that true richness lay not in accumulation, but in contribution and connection. Her will, far from being an insult, was a profound act of teaching, a carefully orchestrated lesson designed to guide me towards a more meaningful existence. It was a legacy of empathy, planted in the fertile ground of my own arrogance. The initial shock of my aunt's will had long since faded, replaced by a quiet, almost reluctant acceptance. The garden, once a symbol of my forced penance, had become a canvas for a different kind of growth, one that mirrored the subtle but profound recalibration happening within me. My focus had shifted from the aggressive acquisition of external resources to the patient cultivation of internal capacity. This wasn't merely about learning to prune roses. It was about understanding the delicate balance of nurturing, the necessity of allowing space for natural development, and the profound satisfaction derived from witnessing organic progress. Now consider how this applies when you're navigating a complex project where rigid control is less effective than fostering an environment of organic innovation. The very act of tending the soil had become a metaphor for cultivating relationships, recognizing that true strength lies not in imposing one's will, but in providing the right conditions for growth. Furthermore, the concept of yield itself underwent a radical redefinition. My previous understanding was solely tied to quantifiable returns, market share, profit margins, acquisition targets. But here, in the quiet hum of the garden, the yield was measured in the unfurling of a new leaf, the vibrant blush of a ripening tomato, the silent communication between different species of plants that somehow coexisted in a delicate ecosystem. This paradigm shift was not a conscious intellectual exercise, but a visceral, felt experience. It was the feeling of the sun on my back, the scent of damp earth after a rain, the tangible evidence of life's persistent, beautiful tenacity. Now consider how this applies when you are evaluating the success of initiatives that don't have immediate, quantifiable financial outcomes. The intrinsic rewards of nurturing and growth were becoming more potent than any external validation I had ever chased. Building on this, however, the most transformative aspect was the confrontation with my own limitations. The garden, in its untamed reality, was a constant reminder that I could not control everything. A sudden hailstorm could obliterate weeks of delicate work. A persistent pest could threaten the entire harvest. This inherent unpredictability, which I had always viewed as an enemy to be conquered, began to reveal itself as an essential element of the natural order. It fostered a sense of humility, a recognition that true wisdom lay not in mastery, but in adaptation and resilience. Now consider how this applies when you encounter unexpected obstacles that force you to abandon your meticulously laid plans. Learning to work with these forces rather than against them unlocked a previously undiscovered reservoir of strength and creativity. Consequently, my interactions with Maya evolved beyond mere acquaintance. Her artistic sensibility, initially perceived as a frivolous pursuit, now seemed to embody a profound understanding of these very principles. She spoke of the creative process as a journey of discovery, of embracing the unexpected detours, of finding beauty in imperfection. Her ability to translate raw emotion and observation into tangible art mirrored the garden's own capacity to transform simple elements into something breathtaking. Now, consider how this applies when you seek to understand and appreciate diverse perspectives that challenge your own ingrained assumptions. Her insights provided a crucial counterpoint to my own increasingly Earth-centric worldview, broadening my understanding of what constituted genuine value and success. This cross-pollination of perspectives between the tangible earth and the abstract canvas was creating a richer, more nuanced understanding of the world. The revelation that my aunt's seemingly simple request was a profound pedagogical tool began to reshape my perspective on ownership. Previously, my understanding of possession was absolute, a zero-sum game where gaining something meant another entity lost it. This house, the garden, the accumulated assets, they were mine by right of inheritance, a victory in the grand scheme of economic warfare. Yet as I delved deeper into her journals, a different notion of custodianship emerged. She wrote not of my house, but of this place, not of my garden, but of the life that thrives here. Nay, Her language suggested a stewardship, a temporary role in a continuum of care, rather than a final possessive claim. Now consider how this applies when you inherit a responsibility that extends beyond mere asset management, demanding a more holistic approach to preservation and legacy. This subtle linguistic shift underscored a fundamental truth. True value wasn't in the act of acquiring, but in the commitment to maintaining and fostering what had been entrusted. Furthermore, this evolving understanding of custodianship directly impacted my approach to decision-making. My default setting had always been one of rapid, decisive action, often driven by the pursuit of immediate personal gain. However, the slow, deliberate pace of the garden demanded a different rhythm. Observing the intricate dependencies within the ecosystem, how the presence of certain insects benefited specific plants, how the soil's composition dictated the growth of others, taught me the interconnectedness of all elements. Rushing a decision, like hastily pulling out a weed without considering its root system, could have unforeseen negative consequences. Now consider how this applies when you're tasked with a complex project where hasty decisions might disrupt delicate interdependencies and undermine long-term stability. I began to approach choices with a greater degree of contemplation, seeking to understand the ripple effects rather than just the immediate impact. This wasn't about indecision. It was about informed, considered action rooted in a deeper appreciation for the system at play. Another crucial layer to this unfolding perspective was the re-evaluation of effort. My prior definition of effort was synonymous with exertion aimed at overcoming resistance, a struggle to bend external forces to my will. The garden, however, presented a different kind of effort, one that involved working in concert with natural processes. Pruning a rose bush wasn't about forcing it into a desired shape, but about understanding its growth patterns and facilitating its health. Watering wasn't about imposing my will on the soil, but about providing a necessary element for life to flourish. Now, consider how this applies when you are engaged in a collaborative endeavor where success hinges on facilitating the contributions of others rather than dictating terms. This shift from forceful imposition to supportive facilitation was a profound departure from my ingrained modus operandi, revealing that true accomplishment often stemmed from enabling growth rather than demanding it. Consequently, this broadened understanding of effort began to seep into my interactions with Maya. Instead of assessing her artistic contributions through a lens of marketability or potential return on investment, I started to appreciate the intrinsic value of her creative process, her dedication, her willingness to experiment, her resilience in the face of creative challenges. These were not just personal qualities, but manifestations of a deeper engagement with her craft. Now consider how this applies when you are working with creative partners whose unique processes may not align with your immediate objectives, but contribute essential, irreplaceable elements to the overall outcome. I recognized that her effort was not about overcoming obstacles for personal gain, but about the deep, often arduous work of bringing authentic expression into being, a process that held its own profound reward independent of any external metric. The concept of legacy had been a foreign one to me, an abstract notion associated with grand gestures and historical pronouncements. My focus had always been on the immediate present, the next quarter, the next acquisition. Aunt Carol's journals, however, painted a different picture. She didn't speak of building empires or leaving indelible marks on the world. Instead, she chronicled small acts of kindness, quiet moments of connection, the subtle ways she had influenced the lives of those around her. She wrote of teaching a neighbor's child to identify constellations, of leaving anonymous donations for struggling families, of simply being a consistent, comforting presence for those who needed it. Now consider how this applies when you're evaluating the impact of your contributions, moving beyond grand achievements to recognize the cumulative effect of everyday actions. Her legacy wasn't etched in stone, but woven into the fabric of countless lives, a testament to the power of consistent, gentle influence. Building on this, however, my own understanding of impact began to broaden. I'd always measured impact by its scale, the size of the deal, the number of people affected, the sheer magnitude of the change I could effect. Aunt Carol's journals revealed a different metric: depth. The profound gratitude expressed by someone whose life she had quietly touched, the enduring memories of a shared moment of understanding. These were the true measures of her influence. It wasn't about how many lives she had touched, but how deeply she had touched the lives she had encountered. Now consider how this applies when you're assessing the effectiveness of your leadership, looking beyond sheer numbers to the quality of the relationships you foster and the genuine well-being of those you lead. The subtle art of genuine connection, I was beginning to understand, could create ripples far more enduring than any aggressive business maneuver. Another crucial layer to this evolving perspective was the realization that true wealth extended far beyond financial accumulation. My aunt, by all external measures, had lived a life of modest means, yet her journals overflowed with a richness of experience that far surpassed my own material abundance. She spoke of the wealth of a clear conscience, the richness of a shared meal, the abundance of a starlit night. These were not mere platitudes. They were deeply felt affirmations of a life lived in alignment with values that transcended monetary worth. Now consider how this applies when you are tempted to measure your own success solely by your financial portfolio, overlooking the immeasurable value of experiences and relationships. The garden, in its simple, unadorned beauty, was a constant reminder that the most valuable harvests were often intangible, cultivated not through acquisition, but through appreciation and mindful presence. Consequently, my interactions with the world began to shift from a transactional to a relational paradigm. The sharp edges of my competitive nature, honed by years of aggressive business dealings, began to soften. I found myself engaging with people not to assess their utility or potential gain, but to simply understand them. Maya's stories of her artistic struggles and triumphs resonated not as potential leverage, but as shared human experiences. The groundskeeper, a taciturn man named George, began to share anecdotes about his family, his voice softening as he spoke of his grandchildren. These were not opportunities for me to exploit, but moments to connect, to acknowledge the shared humanity that bound us all. Now consider how this applies when you find yourself in situations where your initial instinct is to strategize or compete, and instead choose to simply listen and connect. This shift was not a calculated strategy for personal gain, but a genuine evolution, a recognition that the deepest satisfactions came from contributing to the well-being of others, rather than solely pursuing my own. The ongoing process of tending the garden had revealed a profound truth about the nature of impact. It was not always about grand, visible pronouncements, but often about the cumulative effect of consistent, quiet effort. My aunt's journals were a testament to this, filled with chronicles of small acts of compassion that over time had woven a tapestry of positive influence. She didn't seek recognition for these deeds. Her satisfaction lay in the act itself, in the knowledge that she had, in some small way, alleviated suffering or brought a moment of joy into another's life. Now consider how this applies when you are evaluating the long-term significance of your contributions, moving beyond immediate tangible results to appreciate the subtle, enduring effects of consistent positive action. This perspective challenged my ingrained belief that impact was solely defined by scale and visibility, suggesting instead that depth and consistency could yield a more profound and lasting legacy. Building on this, however, the concept of value itself underwent a significant transformation. My previous framework for value was entirely economic, dictated by market forces and profit margins. Yet, in the garden, value was expressed in the vibrant health of a plant, the resilience of a seedling pushing through hardened soil, the intricate beauty of a spider's web glistening with dew. These were not things to be bought or sold, but intrinsic qualities to be appreciated and nurtured. This shift prompted a re-evaluation of what truly constituted abundance, moving beyond material wealth to embrace the richness of experience, connection, and natural beauty. Now, consider how this applies when you're assessing the true worth of your endeavors, looking beyond financial returns to consider the broader societal and personal enrichment they provide. The garden was teaching me that the most valuable assets were often those that could not be quantified. Another crucial layer to this evolving understanding was the realization that growth was not always a linear, upward trajectory. The seasons of the garden offered a powerful metaphor for this. Periods of vibrant bloom were inevitably followed by dormancy and even decay before new life could emerge. This cyclical nature suggested that setbacks and periods of apparent regression were not failures, but essential phases in a larger process of renewal. My own past experiences, once viewed as definitive achievements or failures, began to be seen as integral parts of a continuous journey. Now, consider how this applies when you encounter unexpected challenges or periods of stagnation in your own pursuits, recognizing them not as endpoints, but as necessary stages in a larger developmental arc. This perspective fostered a greater sense of patience and resilience, allowing me to embrace the natural ebbs and flows of progress without succumbing to discouragement. Consequently, my interactions with others began to reflect this newfound appreciation for nuanced growth. I became more attuned to the subtle signs of development in Maya's artistic journey, recognizing that her periods of experimentation and apparent stagnation were not indicators of a lack of talent, but crucial steps in her creative evolution. Similarly, my conversations with George, the groundskeeper, shifted from polite exchanges to deeper discussions about his life experiences, acknowledging the wisdom gained through years of quiet observation and consistent effort. Now consider how this applies when you are collaborating with individuals whose development may not follow a predictable path, valuing their unique journey and contributions rather than imposing your own timeline or expectations. This move away from a rigid, results-oriented approach towards a more empathetic and process-oriented engagement allowed for a richer, more authentic connection to form, mirroring the organic unfolding of life within the garden itself. The true practice begins now. The garden, in its vibrant, ongoing life, serves as a constant reminder that the work of cultivation is never truly finished. It is a continuous process of tending, of adapting, of responding to the ever-changing conditions of life. The lessons learned within its borders extend far beyond the soil and the seasons. They are principles that can guide our interactions, shape our decisions, and redefine our understanding of success. To truly embrace this wisdom is to recognize that the most profound transformations often begin not with a grand declaration, but with a quiet commitment to nurture, to connect, and to simply be present. The most valuable harvests are often invisible, cultivated in the quiet spaces between ourselves and the world.